Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Russell, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, but please, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Robbie. It's a pleasure to be with you too. I'm Russell Kent. I've just published a book on the JFK assassination. It's called JFK Medical Betrayal, and it really looks at the panels of doctors who reviewed the autopsy evidence, and amazingly all came to the conclusion that the autopsy was sound. When I think anyone who's looked at it, even beyond the superficial level, knows that the autopsy wasn't sound. So my question is, what was the motivation for them to do that?
How did you get interested into the assassination?
I kind of always been interested in a low level way. My mum told me where I was. I wasn't old enough to know myself when the assassination occurred. I was in a supermarket in a trolley being pushed around by my dad. And she was always interested in anything that came on the TV regarding the assassination, and always said to me that she didn't believe it was the result of one lone assassin. And so when the JFK film was announced for, I think it was 1991, I was working in Holland, in the Netherlands, and I desperately wanted to go and see the film. I saw it practically the week it was first on in the Netherlands, because they don't always show things in the original language, and luckily they did at this cinema. And there was a huge bookshop in Amsterdam. So you have to imagine this is 1991. There was no Amazon. We didn't have access to American books unless we flew to America to get them. But there was an American bookshop in Amsterdam. And so I went there and I bought every book that I could find that got JFK or JFK assassination on it, and began to read them. And one of the books, I think, had a link or an address for an assassination records bureau, something like that, in Dallas. No, that review board came a bit later in the 90s. This was Assassination Research Center, I think, something like that, based in Dallas. Anyway, I wrote to them, and I'm not sure that they're there anymore. I wrote to them and they said, hey, did I know there was a UK group that looked at the assassination, which of course I didn't. And they put me in touch with this UK group. And then I started to go to their meetings, and eventually plucked up the courage to write something myself and start presenting myself. And so really from the early 90s, I started to write articles for the UK group, DP UK magazine, which is called The Echo. And then I published some things in, what was it called? Not the Fourth Decade, but a similar magazine, Assassination Chronicles, I think it was called. And there was also a website at the time called Fair Play, which I started to publish things on. And I think mid-90s, I went to my first conference, which was called COPA then, Coalition on Political Assassinations, which is in Washington, DC, and began to meet American researchers and just broaden those contacts. And all the time, from the end of the 90s, I had in my mind that there was something wrong with the medical evidence that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't what David Lifton thought, but it was similar to that. I couldn't quite decide what it was. Kept researching, kept talking to people, and eventually had the time to sit down and write a book.
When it comes to the medical evidence, what was the first thing to you that, mine was like the brain witnessing, and nobody knows where the brain is. I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff with the medical evidence.
A lot of weird things, aren't they? I think the thing that struck me most, because my background is in physiology, and I worked at a medical school for a couple of years doing some research with emergency doctors and anesthetists. And the one thing that struck me the most was how different the wounding was when it was described at Parkland to the description in the autopsy. And I knew from my own experience that although emergency doctors don't always get it right, that they don't get it that wrong either. And they all have to write admission reports immediately after a patient has come through the department, or if they've died in the department, of course, which JFK did. And they're very careful about those reports because they're a legal document and they can be used by the deceased family, perhaps to raise a lawsuit if they'd treated things incorrectly. So I had a bias to believe the Parkland doctors. And I began to wonder why the autopsy doctors has got it so differently. In fact, so wrong, I think.
Was that just could be an experience, I would say, when it comes to some of the people that were involved in JFK's first autopsy, or would you say there was a manipulation aspect? Because we know testimonies that did not match. If you're looking at the Warren Commission volumes, and it's hard to get people to that level of like, oh, they manipulated evidence. Well, you got to understand the importance of why all these theories kind of fit in place. I mean, we know the magic bullet theory that just it doesn't make sense. I mean, if you don't even have to fire a gun, but a bullet, coming out undamaged, making all those wounds in people. I mean, I think the rarest occurrence I've ever seen with a bullet is that battle that happened where two bullets collided into each other and they got that. But there's nothing that's like they just comes out unscratched or with a little small little, dent in the top of it after making all those wounds in two people.
I think we have to go with the experience of the forensic pathologist, and it's led by Cyril Wecht's experience that he has never seen a bullet that could do half of that wounding come out in such an undamaged state. And he challenged his fellow forensic pathologists to look through all of their vast catalogue of cases and come up with one bullet that had done anything similar. And of course they couldn't, and it could never be recreated either. And I think the problem is that the whole of the single bullet it hinges on lots of different aspects, but one of the things it hinges on is the throat wound being an exit wound. And of course, nobody ever described it as an exit wound. Even the autopsy pathologists didn't describe it as an exit wound while the body was in the morgue. It wasn't till afterwards that they decided that it must be one to connect with a back wound. So nobody ever described it as an exit wound. The three medical people who looked at it at Parkland, which was Perry, Carrico, and nurse Henschliff, all said it looked like an entrance wound to them. And of course, it was never seen as a wound in the autopsy. So if it wasn't an exit wound, there was never a bullet that went through JFK to then carry on through Connolly.
Well, I mean, even just if you look at an entrance wound or an exit wound, that means it would have to be a hole in the back. And that's when you start to get to where Arlen Specter or whoever it was that moved the bullet hole up 6 inches. The hole was in his back, and they moved it to like close to the back of his neck or one of his vertebrae or something like that. And that's when it starts to get a little like the medical evidence to me, I'm still kind of like, I know a little bit about, but it's still kind of new. I mean, did you look into Arlen Specter at all and trying to see what, his background, when this whole entire theory came up, and when did the first person begin to challenge it?
Yeah, I mean, I've constantly gone against what Specter says. Yeah, Specter's just hovers over the whole of the medical evidence, and his reason for coming up with the single bullet theory was convenience rather than anything else. If you're told by the FBI, which the Warren Commission more or less were, that we've got the guy who did it, he did it, and there's no one else involved, then you have to come up with an explanation for all the wounding. And that's what he did. He more or less invented it based on Hume's assumption that the throat wound was an exit wound. If it's an exit wound in the throat, the next question that a lawyer asks is, where did the bullet go afterwards? And you'll see his questioning throughout the Warren Commission that kind of guides people into accepting that, and then coming to the conclusion that the bullet didn't go anywhere else except for into Connolly. It must have gone into Connolly. Otherwise, there were more bullets and there were more people shooting. So yeah, Specter, he was a junior lawyer. The junior lawyers did all of the questioning and came up with all the different theories and tried to find the evidence to back them up. the senior lawyers hardly did anything because they weren't being paid enough. And the junior lawyers were actually getting paid more by the Warren Commission than they could earn on a daily basis anyway. So they were quite happy to do all the work. The senior lawyers did nothing, and the Warren commissioners, well, if you've read anything by Walt Brown, you'll know that they took a very minor role.
When it comes to just being attracted to the Parkland Hospital instead of Bethesda, what attracted you the most to just the Parkland Hospital? Did you consider that like that was probably I would say not the best evidence, but at least the probably most important autopsy before you get to Bethesda and everything becomes a little bit murky and tricky because that's where it seems like most of the manipulation starts to happen?
Sure, and of course there wasn't an autopsy at Parkland, but I'll tell you something about Parkland. If you were going to get shot anywhere in the southwestern United States, you certainly wanted it to be near to Parkland Hospital. They treated hundreds of gunshot wounds. They were a specialist in them, really, and they've written a book. There's a book called the Parkland Trauma Handbook. So they are more or less specialists in trauma, and certainly every one of the doctors that looked at JFK when he was in there were hunters themselves, done a lot of shooting themselves, and had treated hundreds of gunshot wounds. It was a center of expertise for it. So my feeling is that those doctors are more reliable on evidence of gunshot wounds, entrance, exits. Of course, they didn't try to find out what the tracts of the wounds were in the body or find the bullets. They were just interested in saving the president's life.
I mean, when it comes to I guess the best people for the job, do you think the Parkland doctors would have even had a chance at doing anything to help JFK?
Not really. He was certainly he was alive, but he had what they call agonal respiration, which means he was attempting. His brain was attempting to make his lungs work. He had a heartbeat on and off, but he'd lost too much of his brain to survive. I can't believe he would have survived. Certainly, if you believe the Parkland doctor's explanation of the injuries, there was injury to the cerebellum, and one doctor said that the injury was to the extent that he could see the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the base of the skull where the brainstem carries on through to the spine. And any injury down there is, it's hasta la vista.
Did you think it was weird that when they had to move the president's body and bring it back to Air Force One and get ready to fly, that when the Texas autopsy doctors who usually does, it's Texas state law to, that's up to them. What is it, the lead pathologist or the lead?
Yeah, it was, I think it's the law in every state, really. A homicide that happens in the state has to have an autopsy in the state. It's all to do with the chain of custody of the body. But it was Earl Rose, who was the pathologist. He was the forensic pathologist in Parkland, who was ready to do the autopsy. And it was he and a justice of the peace that challenged the moving of the body. But of course, the Secret Service were very intent on getting the body out. And I don't know whether there's much of conspiracy there. I try to put myself back in those times. Now, the president was worried that the new president, Lyndon Johnson, he appeared to be worried that there was going to be further attacks. He didn't know that there weren't going to be, perhaps when they tried to get back to the planes. So he ordered everybody back to the plane. He wanted to get out of Dallas, essentially. And Jackie wouldn't go without her husband's body. So the body had to come too. And I think it's as simple as that.
Yeah, it was. I talked to Brad Parker, who interviewed a lot of these doctors when he was 17 years old, and started pulling up the phone book and calling these guys. He said it was just a security issue. The Secret Service had to get the president to a safe location, and at this point, they had to get his body any way possible. When it comes to the stuff that you wrote about in your book, the first little bit of manipulation when it comes to evidence or when it comes to just things not matching up that eventually led into the official statements from the Warren Commission. Could you take me through some of it?
Yeah, of course. The Warren Commission itself, if you read some of the executive sessions, the transcripts from the executive sessions, rather than the interviews with witnesses and the report, you can find that they were at a bit of a loss to explain the wounding. And so they tried to get some doctors involved at the Edgewood Arsenal proving ground, where there was the ballistics facility that they could do some shooting with the original rifle and see if they could recreate any of the evidence. So at least back themselves up on what they thought had happened. So they got, there was 4 doctors involved. Although if you read the book, you'll find that some of them were involved more than others. The guy that really did all the work was a veterinarian called Olivier. And he did most of the experiments and wrote all the experiments up. But essentially, they did the wrong experiments. They tried to see whether the Manica Caccano had the power to penetrate 2 bodies, which of course it does. And my answer to that is, so what? But they also tried shooting skulls and reproducing the wounding of the skulls. And they couldn't do that either. In fact, they couldn't do anything that they actually tried, they set out to do. They tried to show that entrance wounds could be smaller than, sorry, entrance wounds could be larger than exit wounds, and they couldn't do that either. So that was the first kind of manipulation of the evidence. And if you read the report, or you read the witness statements with Olivier, you wouldn't know that. You have to sort of look at the evidence and get the report from the Aberdeen Proving Ground to look at that.
So they only chose the ones that best fit the narrative.
Well, yes, and that, you know, Robbie, that's one of the problems with the science here. It's junk science, because a lot of the experiments, they're either not repeatable, or they're repeated an insufficient number of times to be statistically analyzable, or statistically significant. Try and say that on a Monday afternoon when you've had a cup of tea. Can't say statistically. But yeah, the science is junk because they just don't do it. And they don't do it frequently enough. The experiments, they're not repeatable, and they pick and choose the evidence that supports them, their theory, rather than publishing all information. And that happens in the science throughout the JFK case. It's particularly irksome to me as a scientist.
Before I ask you about the next experiment or the next thing that you saw an issue with, when it comes to the 4 doctors that were involved in the first experimentation, or the first experiment of just testing out with 2 bodies, did any of them disagree? Did any of them make a public statement about, we're not, you can't pick and choose evidence? It seems like there's a lot of cherry picking, and that's with both sides, CT and low nut. It seems like there's a lot of cherry picking of evidence that best fits your side. It's kind of like I guess, a courtroom trial. You want to do everything to make sure your client is either innocent or trying to prosecute him, I guess. But it becomes an issue because you have an investigation. It seems like the investigation was very, very thorough. In my opinion, the Warren Commission was thorough, but it was thorough in every aspect. It shouldn't have been thorough. There's no reason to have Jack Ruby's mother's dental records inside the Warren Commission. That doesn't make sense, but I don't know.
Well, there were some people who spoke out. One of the doctors from the Aberdeen Proving Ground, Dr. Dolce, he spoke out. He contacted his senator, I believe, to say that he thought this was wrong. And of course, when it came to being interviewed under oath by the Warren Commission, they didn't call him. They called the other 3, but they didn't call Dolce. So yeah, there have been some people who have spoken out.
Did they explain why they didn't call him?
Oh, no explanation. No, and really he was the most qualified person to call. He should have been called, but he wasn't. No, I mean, it's like they're silent about a lot of people that they didn't call. And you look at all the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, not all of them were called.
So when it comes to at least any of the doctors, that best medical professionals that would be given on an investigation like this, that would probably have the best statements. I mean, who didn't agree with the official narrative?
Well, the major one is Cyril Wecht, of course, who got involved with it in the 70s. He had a major disagreement, and there was another doctor called John Nichols, who also disagreed. And if you read the book, you'll find out that his evidence was removed from the HSCA report, the forensic pathology report. He had a whole appendix attached to it. At one point, it was taken out.
So was there manipulation in the HSCA's investigation?
Oh my goodness!
What?
Oh my goodness, yes. Yeah.
This is where I'm new on the AARB and the HSC. I never really looked into a whole lot. I just knew the HSCA's funding ran out, but they concluded that there was a probable conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and I think Blakey is the one that said it was the mafia. But I'm curious if they had anybody that was involved in that panel that would have had manipulation on any of the results that we would have gotten.
Oh, well, of course they didn't do any testing. Cyril Wecht called for them to do testing. He couldn't understand why the weight of the government and the money that the government had couldn't be put into doing a few tests. But they absolutely refused to do them. The HSCA is an area that a lot of people don't look at because it's a lot more difficult to look at than the Warren Commission. There's been less work on it, and access to the volumes has been more difficult. But there's 13 volumes of evidence in the HSCA on Kennedy and 13 on Martin Luther King. And I'll just give you one example. The medical panel that looked at the Kennedy evidence was led by Michael Barden, and there were, I can't remember exactly how many other doctors, 8 or 9, and they spent, I think it's 3 days looking at the evidence before they started drafting their report. Of course, 3 days is massively insufficient. How could you possibly? It'd be difficult to read the Warren report in 3 days, 888 pages, let alone look at the films and the autopsy evidence, the X-rays, the photographs, the different experiments that Latimer did, the write-ups by against it by Cyril Wecht. They couldn't possibly have looked at all that evidence, but the same doctor, Michael Barden, led the panel that looked at the MLK evidence, and he did all that in 3 days as well. It's just remarkable to me that these people can come up with a conclusion so quickly if they'd not already decided. There is no way you could. If you honestly looked at the evidence, it would take more than 3 days.
So when it comes to the next, I guess, thing in your mind that raises red flags when it comes to the medical evidence, before we even get to any of the brain or the Harper fragment, any of that interesting stuff, I'm more interested in the interviews with the doctors or just what the doctors were saying, and also what type of experiments did they really do? And we talked about one already, but it just seems like a lot of stuff where it's like this investigation really is lacking, I guess, the definition of an investigation. I think it was, like I said, thorough, but it just seemed like there was a lot of things that could have been used and could have been beneficial to keep it on going, but it seems like had to be wrapped up tight.
Yeah, I guess there are experiments you can do, and various television companies and other and some doctors. John Latimer, for instance, did a lot of experiments. Have you heard of John Latimer? Dr. Latimer? Oh, okay, all right. So he did a bunch of shooting experiments with his sons in the late 60s, early 70s. He had a Manica Caccano, and he got hold of some bullets which he considered were from the same batch that Oswald was accused of firing, and he set up some test rigs with different kinds of meat wrapped in clothing, and so that it went through one approximation of a body and then hit a skull that he put on a set of steps. I met him in Philadelphia, and he was really nice. I really liked him, and he agreed to have a sort of exchange of letters with me. We didn't really have email together at that time, so I wrote to him a bunch of questions, and he very kindly answered all the questions. But it's essentially what his whole experiment was skewed, because he wasn't at the correct elevation. He only tried shooting from one position. So this is the thing about science. If you only try one thing and it works, it's not sufficient. You've got to try other shooting positions and show that it doesn't work. And he never did that, of course. He only tried one. And in any case, he didn't recreate the wounding to JFK, or he didn't recreate the single bullet theory either. So go and have a look at John Latimer. A nice guy. I liked him a lot. And what's more, he was a brilliant scientist. He did a lot of really good work in the field of urology. And he was a pioneer in many ways. And he wrote well over 100 scientific papers. And as I say, he was a nice guy. He just got it wrong. There have been other people who did experiments. I have mentioned John Nichols. I don't have access to all of his experimental data. We know that Dr. Olivia, the veterinarian from the Edgewood Arsenal, he did some more experiments for CBS television. And some of them you can get hold of now on YouTube. So there have been some experiments done, but nothing after the Edgewood Arsenals that was official. So nothing by the Clark panel, the Rockefeller panel. Well, the Rockefeller panel was a joke, or the HSCA.
I'm guessing with the platform, I guess if you had an actual investigation that had a platform to mainstream media, then people probably would have raised more flags at it. But since I guess the official media wasn't really covering the more conspiratorial side of things or the real evidence that there's lacking of evidence, I would say, when it comes to the official narrative. But when it comes to, did you notice about Malcolm? It's Malcolm Perry. Malcolm Perry made a statement and then immediately went back on it. And I've heard people say that he was pressured, obviously. I don't know if you looked into that at all, or if you looked into the manipulation when they drew up the skull and they had two people that were pressuring the drawer of whoever was drawing up this illustration. Like I said, the medical evidence to me is one I kind of stayed away from because it's a lot there. But it seemed like manipulation, pressuring someone, hey, draw it like this and draw it like this. And that was the one that was officially included in.
Yeah, sure. It's difficult to find evidence that somebody was manipulated, but I'm sure that Perry was lent on. He certainly at the first press interview at Parkland Hospital when the death of the president was announced, he said that he thought the throat wound was an entrance wound, and he discussed with his fellow doctors about how that wounding could have occurred, and a lot of them thought that the entrance wound in the throat resulted in an exit wound in the back of the head. And that's what they really thought had happened. He'd been shot in the neck and it had come out of his head, the back of his head. And there is some evidence that the Secret Service lent on him. But, you've got to feel sorry for the guy. He's not quite at the beginning of his career. He was a resident surgeon. He was a vascular surgeon, but he still got a long way to go in his career. He was young. And what is there to be gained swimming against this? The president was dead, and there was nothing going to bring him back, and Lee Harvey Oswald was dead. And I think the guys at Parkland just decided, well, we'll just keep our heads down and keep our jobs, because what is there to be gained?
Besides, I remember with your book, you wrote about the Clark panel. I'm very interested in learning more about the Clark panel. I'm just wondering if there was any other investigations that seemed to wrap this up in a certain way, mostly when it comes to coercion. I know we know doctors that made statements, obviously, more conspiratorial, saying they didn't, their official statements didn't match what the Warren Commission had, but they didn't get any airtime. So I'm trying to figure out who are the people that got airtime. Who was the Clark panel? Who are people that wrapped up this investigation in such a way where nobody, like the general public, I think it's like 60-something% thought there was conspiracy behind it. Yet somehow this completely went through the hands of everything, and it didn't come until I think it wasn't the 90s or something when the JFK film came out. And that's when the Assassination Records Review Board started going through and, unredacting documents and everything. But I mean, until then, all that time, and I know it's slow document release of everything that's been coming out to where people, I mean, they still think it's a conspiracy today, but people say they'll just roll their eyes and walk away from it. And we've let it go for so long, almost 60 years now.
Yeah, that's right. It has been let go, really. Of course, the Clark panel was brought about because the Department of Justice was worried that somebody would eventually get access to the autopsy materials, and the autopsy materials, they're such a minefield that the photographs don't match the X-rays. Neither the photographs or X-rays match the autopsy report, and I think the Department of Justice knew that material was dynamite in the right hands, and that's the way it has proved to be. That so the Clark panel was really to keep people away from that, to make people believe that a proper panel of forensic pathologists or doctors had looked at this evidence and come to the conclusion that it was sound. There was only actually two forensic pathologists on the Clark panel. There was Dr. Fisher and Alan Moritz. And the other two guys on the panel One was a pathologist, Dr. Carnes, and Russell Morgan, who was a radiologist. The picking of the Clark panel is particularly suspect, and if you see my recent presentation, you'll know all about that. There was an effort made by the Department of Justice via Ramsey Clark to make it appear that the panel had been chosen by independent academics when it clearly hasn't been. I had a look to try and find out if there was any letters between the people who apparently nominated the doctors and Ramsey Clark or the DOJ or any of the doctors that they apparently nominated, and there wasn't any. There were no letters between those people. There was no communication that I could find. And Ramsey Clark has archives, and one of the two of the doctors had huge archives I could look through. Nothing. So I think what happened was that Fisher was appointed, and Fisher was the closest thing to a government forensic pathologist. He, of course, he worked in Baltimore, and he was the Baltimore medical examiner, but he also taught at Johns Hopkins University. And if you think about where the money was coming from to Fisher, it was all government money. So it was very unlikely he was going to go against the government. I believe that Fisher chose the panel. And if you look at the people on the panel, it makes a lot more sense that Fisher chose the panel, because the two people, Carnes and Morgan, were both people that he knew from Johns Hopkins University, and Alan Moritz was his old professor from Harvard. So, you know, the connections to Fisher were much more solid than connections to anybody else.
Do you think it was a friend aspect, or do you think it was more of an aspect of like how academics do now? Like if you have a paper that needs to be published and you know a couple of people, most of the time people will read like a brief little introduction to it, and then they'll just sign their name at the bottom of it. So it looked like they thoroughly looked through your paper, but now you got that person's title and their name hooked to your academic paper now.
Yeah, certainly. Of course, the Clark panel report was never published and peer reviewed, which I think is what you're getting at, is peer reviews in scientific journals. It was never treated in that way. But the point about journals is that they'd all written together. So at some stage, they'd worked together on scientific papers, not necessarily on the Clark panel, but if you look at the HSCA panel, there's a whole web of interconnectedness where the doctors had either written papers together, or they'd studied together, they'd been friends with Fisher, or they'd contributed chapters towards a book together. They all knew each other. This veneer of independence is scratched away in my book. These guys were not independent in any way. Independent. They all were subservient in some way to Russell Fisher, who decided one way for the government. And of course, he was basically a government employee.
I mean, I get the benefits of towing the company line, but don't you think that even if you're getting government funding, if it's just to look at the investigation or just to do anything to do the proper experiment to lead to an actual correct answer, you feel like if it was probably more independent, you would have got better results?
Well, Fisher was smarter than we give him credit for sometimes. What he did is he found a passage in the Warren report and a passage in the autopsy report, which he thought he could support. So when he looked at the evidence, all he had to do was say, this evidence supports the aforementioned two paragraphs that he quoted. It didn't necessarily support everything the government believed, but it supported those things. So he was clever in that respect. He was also clever that the Clark panel mission was not to review the evidence and make sure that it was mutually compatible. That is, that the X-rays matched the photographs, matched the autopsy report. The mission of the Clark panel was to look at the autopsy evidence and decide what weighting that evidence had on the statements in the report. And so it would have been sufficient for them to produce a table that said AP skull X-ray, highly significant, thorax X-ray, medium significance. So they didn't have to actually go through and write something critical of the autopsy report. It's a very clever way of doing it.
So it's kind of like lawyer speak. Like if you read the Warren Commission, and if you look at the members that are still alive on the Warren Commission, there are in the secondary committee. They're all law kids. They're all just kids from like look like the same profile as Arlen Specter. I would say actually invited some on the show. There's no way they're gonna do it, but at the same time, it's just like it's interesting to see because if you read the Warren Commission, it's like lawyer speak. You read it and you feel like you read it wrong the first time, and then you reread it again. The first time you read it, you probably read it correct, where there was like, wait, that doesn't say that, does it? And then you read it again, you go, okay, that's what I thought. I made a mistake. It's because it's lawyer speak. It's the hardest thing to understand. And if you look at, anything when it comes to medical or when it comes to anything that's investigation wise, you would expect more detail as possible. But a lot of the ways that they were able to get rid of it is by using language referencing another page or doing something like that. That would be like, okay, so obviously it's written down somewhere, so it's confirmed at this point. Well, no, they didn't go into detail for a reason.
That's right. And the Clark report was written by Fisher with a lawyer, the Clark panel lawyer, and the HSCA report, the lawyers couldn't keep their hands off that either. At least three of them had a go at writing some of that report or changing it. There's some really strange stuff went on in the HSCA forensic pathology panel report, which was lawyer speak.
When it comes to the HSCA, though, the HSCA had a lot of problems going on with it. I think they were all constantly I don't think it was sued, but they were constantly having to show up in court. And there was just a lot of things that were going on that obviously seemed like it was hindering their investigation, besides just money just funding out as well, too.
Well, the HSCA, the pathologists just didn't work very closely together. The first thing they did was split the panel in half, not quite equal halves. There was Group A that looked at the forensic evidence for 3 days, the pathology evidence, and Group B looked at it for 2 days, and then they all went away. And they didn't actually get back together for 6 months when they talked to the photography panel, I believe. And then again, they went away for 6 months before coming back to, I don't know that they all came back, but to hear Humes give evidence in 1978. So they actually spent very little time together. In the times between those meetings, they were drafting the reports. But if you read what the guys said, essentially the first panel A, which did not include Cyril Wecht, decided after 3 days, well, we know what happened here, and they began to write their conclusions down immediately after 3 days. So what took them another year to come up with the full report, nobody's quite sure until now, because I got hold of all the drafts that they wrote, and I found out what took them time. They had to manipulate the reports to take stuff out which didn't support the government, or put stuff in, or completely change whole passages.
Now, when you say take
And you
stuff,
wouldn't know that.
when you take stuff out, is it just like stuff that doesn't seem like it's beneficial? But I guess for maybe people in the JFK community, you want to know every aspect of it, so it might seem official. Like I could ask you the same question about your book. Like, how did you choose out of all the medical evidence to what the audience should know, what you found was the most crucial? Because there's a lot of stuff if you're in the JFK community, or if you're a fan and you're trying to understand the assassination, you're just really interested in the research of it, everything's important. But when it comes to just trying to get new audiences interested into it and just try and show like the official best evidence, no pun intended, of just the medical evidence.
Yeah, that is a trick, Robbie, which takes a while to learn. I have to say. I mean, you could spend hours and hours and days and days, years, if you like, writing all of everything, every little aspect of the medical evidence, but you have to decide what your reader would be interested in. And that was quite tricky for me. A lot of people ask me, who's going to read this book? And what I wanted was to write a book on the medical evidence that anybody could pick up, anyone who was interested in the JFK case, and they didn't have to be an expert on the medical evidence. So I go to great pains to try and explain the different anatomy and what a particular conclusion might mean that's not been done before in other books. And I also, the other side of the coin, if you like, is I knew that anybody interested in the JFK case, who goes to the conferences, who buys all the books, who listens to podcasts like your own, they're going to pick it up and they're interested in the detail. So you've got to walk this line between the general information and finding the best evidence, but at the same time providing the detail that the people like yourself need. And the way I did that was I tried to keep everything that was very detailed into footnotes. And so you'll find it's a over 250-page book, which is long enough already, but there's 750 citations. So if you're interested in that particular aspect, you can look where I got the information from and do a bit more reading.
Now back to another question I had, which was just the manipulation. Like, how big was the manipulation? How did the doctors choose to put what in and take stuff out? Like, was it big things when they come to taking out a complete thing, or just completely missing the ball in general? Or was it small, little, what they would consider unimportant details that they were just manipulating?
There were some quite big things. For instance, if you're not familiar with the HSCA, one of the things that they did, because they had the technology at the time, was they tried to computer enhance some of the X-rays. Excuse me. And in the volumes of the report there, they published 2 of those computer enhancements, but they actually did 6, and they didn't publish those. So that there was some that would be very interesting for us to look at. And you have to ask the question, why didn't they publish those? Why not? Why put the original ones in when you've done enhancements of them? And the only reason not to put them in is because they didn't show the evidence that the HSCA wanted to show. So for instance, the wounding in the neck, they very much wanted us to believe there was wounding to the either the bottom cervical vertebrae C7 or the top thoracic vertebrae T1. They very much wanted us to believe there were bone fragments or fragments of bullets there. And they printed the relevant X-ray, but they printed the original, not their enhanced version. So the answer is that that X-ray didn't show that. If it had shown that, it would have been on the cover. So those were missed out.
It's so
About
weird why they only picked 2 out of the 6, though. I mean, that's just a bad number. I mean, I would have to say that anybody looking at it that doesn't have a degree or doesn't focus on medical evidence, that's why I applaud you for trying to, brief the general public about medical evidence, because a lot of this you do kind of need a degree for. You need to have some prior knowledge in this field. But I just figured it's like what Alan Dulles' statement was, which is the public doesn't read anyway. And it's kind of like if you're putting up medical evidence, if you just put up these 2 pictures, people aren't going to want to look at it or know what it is anyway to decipher if you're wrong or not.
Yeah. But it's like I was saying earlier, one of the things in scientific publications is you must publish all your data, not just the data that supports your theory. And of course, that's what every one of these investigations did. They published only what supported their theory. Another omission, if you like, was the docs drawings. There were at least one more docs drawing than were published, and I have a copy of that, and I put it in my book, so it won't have been published anywhere else. And there were various omissions of sentences. Well, one big omission, which I mentioned earlier, was John Nichols. He had a whole appendix that was deleted. I don't have a copy of the appendix, unfortunately. The drafts that I got did not have all the appendices attached. It was a bit of a shame. And they did some other things that you might find surprising. You're aware of the description of the back wound being moved up by the Warren Commission to be a back of the neck wound,
Yeah, by 6
which was
inches.
apparently Ford that did that. They did exactly the same thing in the HSCA report. Originally, it was described as a back wound, and it was then described as a back and neck wound. So there's manipulation going on all over the place in that report.
Man, I've been talking up the HSCA and looking at their volumes, going like, look what they prove, look what they prove, and there's manipulation in that too. That's it's so shameful. Where even if you have another investigation that comes later and they choose to maybe correct some things, but then leave some stuff the same. It's the same reason with the AARB. Like, they declassified a lot of documents, and I'm hopefully going to be speaking to Judge Turnheim, who's spoken out about a couple of things, but even I don't know if he agrees with the lone gunman theory still, because
Oh,
where's
he
the
does.
So so where's this the what did they see in the documents is my question. Like I get if it's a threat to national security, but I'm starting to feel like it's kind of like a situation where if it was like a mafia or if it was rogue elements of the CIA, I would think as an organization you would just get the blame for it. It wouldn't be these individual people. But that's a lot we find in the assassination is people want to go, what names? What names of the people? Who are the rogue elements? I'm like, well, it's going to be like JFK and the Bay of Pigs. You just have to take the blame as the president or as the chief of whoever. That's the CIA. The whole organization has to take the blame for it.
Well, Robbie, don't think that the Assassination Records Review Board looked at every document. They did not. They looked at very few of the documents, a very small percentage of the documents, way less than 1% of the documents. What they did was they only reviewed the documents where there was a question. So if the FBI or the CIA said, we're not going to release this document because we still think it has a national security implication, those were the documents that the board reviewed. The others were just accepted. They just put them straight into the archive, 99%. So the Records Review Board did not look at this case at all. They only reviewed the documents that had a national security implication.
So didn't they also have problems with like the CIA and the Secret Service?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Secret Service. I'm not an expert in this area, but I believe the Secret Service destroyed a lot of documents rather than hand them over. Yeah, and of course, the first thing, the natural position of the CIA and to some extent the FBI is we can't release this document because it has security implications. That is their default position.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
Well, who knows what security implications they may have. I mean, usually it's because it reveals an agent that's still in the field or something like that. But after all this time, that surely cannot be the case. 60 years on, anybody who's involved in the assassination business, it's a very dangerous business. You're probably dead yourself within a few years.
Do you think, I mean, just as a random question, but do you think that if the doctors would have had a platform like how we have with social media today, where there's a lot of more independent media, do you think that their message would have got out there and we probably would have gotten more progress into the Kennedy assassination? It seems like we're still going, but it seems like it would have been a lot more beneficial if they could get on a better, I mean, Geraldo Rivera playing the Zapruder film was, I mean, probably a very big step for a lot of things. And
Oh yeah,
then
enormous.
he kind of now toes the company line in a way, kind of changed. But I think, if we had more sources like that or more independent, and I've seen plenty of newspapers that talked about alleged assassin Oswald, alleged, killer Castro. Like it seemed like they were kind of running the line a little bit, which didn't agree with how most magazines kind of, I guess, propagandize these people in history as, either the killer of the president or just an outrageous dictator. And I'm not saying that there's not horrible things maybe that happen, but I'm just looking at it like you're seeing a little bit more balance in that aspect of getting both sides. And that makes it even more difficult because then you'll have people that want to agree with what they want to agree with rather than look at what maybe the truth might be.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right. If the Zapruder film had come out early in the 1960s and the forensics evidence had been available, the autopsy evidence had been available, I'm sure there would have been a huge clamor for an investigation, a new investigation, and a proper investigation. But of course, the people who get onto those investigation panels they're chosen by the government. In the end, the government chooses who goes on them. And one of the things I argue in my book is that really what's needed is for somebody who's not being paid by Uncle Sam to get onto one of these panels to have a look at it. Then there's a whole bunch of forensic pathologists in the UK, and I'm sure there are in Canada and Australia and India and many other countries who would be totally independent, who could look at this stuff. You bring it all out of the National Archives, bring it to London, have Dr. Richard Shepherd and some of his associates have a look at it. And I think you're going to get a very different opinion.
Do you have anything that you didn't include in your book that you felt like maybe you're having some second thoughts on? Like maybe you should have included that in there, would have been important.
There is one thing that since I've been speaking to different groups about this, since the book came out in July, I produced a table that if you saw my presentation recently, you've seen this table of the web of connections between the HSCA doctors. Now, originally, I would have put that in the book, but it's very difficult to publish a book with tables and lots of photographs in it. It rapidly gets very expensive and gets very difficult to position everything correctly. And that table needed to be a whole page. I just couldn't make it work really. That would have been nice because I think that has persuaded quite a few people that the HSCA panel was a lot less um, independent than has been made out. And they certainly had a lot of connections with each other.
Do you find that people, I guess, are as stumped as I am when it comes to asking questions about the medical evidence? It's confusing. It's just there's so much about it that it's all over the place. And like I said, if you don't have an official title or any work or progress into this thing, you need a diagram, you need a step-by-step guide to kind of walk you through it to be able to envision it as well. So I think everybody can get on the level that a bullet cannot make the trajectory that it did and still have very little damage on it. But then you get into manipulation. I mean, for a while, I didn't believe David Lifton's best evidence when it comes to bashing in a skull and taking bullet fragments out. I was like, all right, I don't know about that. And I'm into a lot of that deep government stuff. But then I heard interviews with William Law and a bunch of other people that talk to these doctors. And I'm like, okay, it's 100% possible. Nobody can explain why the ambulance went missing for like 45 minutes. And you just get into this weird area where it's like, all right, could this be true? Could they go this far to try and cover up? And then I had to look into like I said, I'm not an expert in the medical evidence. I'm very rough on that area. But when it comes to the policies and it comes to just that threat of communism, I find myself fascinated with that and start learning they ramped up that ball 100%. And the fear of going to a world war because somebody might have killed Kennedy, it had to be Oswald.
Mm, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's such a difficult area to get into if you don't have any background, which is, why. Luckily, I have got the background, so I can understand it, and I can. What I try to do is to explain it at a level that everybody can understand it, because there's nothing magical about medical evidence. You just have to get it down to the level that everybody can understand, and not use terribly big words. When you use the word parietal, you have to show people on the head where parietal is. Um, so I think you're right that it's difficult for people to get into. But it's one of the reasons that I've written the book, and one of the reasons that I like to go and talk about it, um, particularly in the UK, where we have a lot of historical societies who are very interested in JFK and the assassination of JFK. And I have to take it right down to the level that everybody can understand. Otherwise, you're standing up in front of people and bamboozling them. There's no advantage to doing that.
What's the most common questions that you get?
Oh, everybody always asks, if Oswald didn't do it, who did do it? And
It's
my
a dumb
stock
question.
answer is, yeah. Stock answer is, if I knew, I'd be dead, because I'm not sure that it's even knowable now. Everything is so cold. The evidence is so cold, and what evidence we have is so poor. There isn't. I can't think of a single piece of evidence that's not tainted in some way, has not been changed, substituted, altered, misrepresented in some way. And without that, I'm not sure you can ever prove who it was. I don't believe it was Oswald, but God, I don't know who did it.
When it comes,
I have an idea. I have a theory, um, and I'll try and explain it. I think that there were multiple shooters who were patsies, if you like, in that they were going to be discovered, and who were pro-Castro Cubans. And the idea was for this plot to be discovered of multiple shooters, and then that would allow the military to go into Cuba, the US military to go into Cuba. I think that was the idea. But at some stage, somebody pulled it and decided that multiple shooters, and this wasn't such a good idea. And for some reason, one or two were left behind to do the deed. And it was all pinned on Oswald. And I think there's other people believe that as well. I have no evidence for that, but I sometimes, like you, I lie awake at night thinking, well, if he didn't do it, who did do it? Come up with something.
it's interesting. I had a guy on my show, Barry Jones, who studied Watergate. He actually wrote a book about coup d'etat, about the Kennedy assassination. And he said it was Nixon. And he said what they were talking about on that 18 minutes of that tape that's missing on Nixon's secret tapes was the Kennedy assassination. Well, I had the guy who was the defendant for on Nixon's team during the Watergate trial on my show, and I asked him what was on that 18 minutes, and I wouldn't let it go. I was like, "What's on that 18 minutes of tape?" And I go, "Is it the Kennedy assassination?" And he skipped that question. And I'm like, okay, so I mean, that's a theory out there, obviously. Like, I don't know, but I heard it in the way that I was explained to it. I mean, if you look at Howard Hunt, if you look at the people that, Nixon was going against Kennedy in before Kennedy beat him in the election. And Traficante, I don't know if it's Traficante or another mafia guy, makes a statement because the idea was that Nixon was gonna hire this team, if it's Operation 40 or whatever the team was called, to assassinate Castro. And what happened was that was going to happen so he could win the election against Kennedy. It was all supposed to happen and unfold. It didn't happen. Kennedy won. But as what we have from, I think it's Traficante's interview, where he goes, make sure, the future president's on board. And when he says future president, he's mentioning Nixon because everyone thought Nixon was going to win. And Nixon sent his aide. And that was confirmation as you have Nixon's approval and everything. And then later during Watergate, what he was afraid of was, I don't know if it was Hunt or somebody else when he got arrested, he had a check to the same bank where 20 years prior was the one that Nixon hired them to do. It's there's so many connections in it that obviously, like I said, it's a good theory. It's, obviously you don't have any proof until the government makes an official statement on it, but it leaves you wondering because I mean, even with all the doctors that did speak out and all the doctors that just went silent, I mean, they went silent because they probably got tired of talking about it. People say like these guys are looking for attention. I go, you don't get good attention talking about this. Gary Aguilar, David Mancic, any of these people that are working in the field and still have a, working practice going on, it doesn't look good for you to be saying these things. So you have to actually believe it. And that's why they're willing to speak about it.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is very little to be gained by swimming against the government opinion. There isn't, and it's not prized in science either to be a maverick, not really. So you're right. Gary Aguilar and David Mantic have got practices to defend, and so it's to their credit that they do speak out about it. Cyril Wecht, of course, is retired more or less now. I know he does some consultancy, but he was attacked, as you know.
Yeah. When it comes to acceptance, I mean, is there more of an interest in the UK than there is in the States? It seems like I'm probably one of like all my generation that seems to really have a heavy interest in the assassination.
I wouldn't say there was more interest in the UK, but it doesn't carry the same negative air that it may do in the States. I think a lot of the times, if you're a conspiracy theorist, which we all get painted with the same brush there, if you're a conspiracy theorist in the US, you're a bit kooky. That's not the same here. We believe in conspiracies here because we know that Julius Caesar was assassinated due to conspiracy. And we know practically every assassination was due to a conspiracy. The one that caused the First World War, Gavrilo Princip shooting the Archbishop in Sarajevo. We know that conspiracies exist, so we're not so worried about being seen to be not pursuing one, but supporting one.
Well, it's hard to lay it out as a conspiracy or call someone a conspiracy theorist when they literally show you the evidence that just doesn't match what a normal investigation would do. The
Well,
amount
most
of
people don't
cherry
know that.
picking.
Yeah, most people don't know that. Most people just, I mean, you've gone far deeper into this than most people do. And even you are thinking that the HSCA got it right when they didn't. So most people don't go into it to that depth. And when they do, they come to a stage where they think, well, I've done everything I can now, and I've got to make a decision. Either this investigation was correct or not. And certainly in the US, it's easier to get hold of these materials because I guess most major libraries in the States have got the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission report. Most of them have got the HSCA report. They're almost impossible to get hold of here, the books themselves. Of course, we have most of it online now, but it is a different matter to hold the book in your hand. And the very few people have got those, and no library has them here. probably none in Europe.
It's just
Maybe the British Library, yeah, but
it's hard to keep people's attention span. I mean, we forgot Epstein like it was nothing. Like that was the weird thing to me. Where I know that that's a different topic, but when it comes to Epstein, they said he committed suicide. I go, the dude left 6 days out of the week out of prison. He was only there supposed to be there one day with an open jail cell, and I go, there's just a lot of things that don't add up to it. But I mean, I guess it's hard for people to dig into stuff like this. I mean, you can think. I think people all have their, I guess, boundary lines when it comes to conspiracy things they can buy with, like government manipulating media. I think that's a stereotype now. Like everyone agrees with that. But when it comes to like how far it will go, like I said, it took me a while to get to David Lifton's idea of bashing in, Kennedy's head or something like that. Cause it's so horrible. You don't want to, I guess, to think it to be true. And I guess it would be different. Like if we were talking about a UK incident and it was in the US, we would probably believe it because it's not our government. But the fear is at home. The fear is that it's here. And that's what's so scary when someone says that day in 63 is a turning point in history. It's like when people say that they don't want to look into that because they don't know what else that can lead to. And we know about Watergate's a good example, but it's just so disconnected from a lot of people's purview.
yes, and Chappaquiddick, and yeah, I mean, the Epstein case certainly has been reviewed. It was actually reviewed by Michael Barden, and he was the one that said it clearly wasn't suicide. So yeah, Michael's done quite a few of those, kind of reviewing different autopsies. I can't remember all the cases. I mentioned some of them in the book, but he definitely did the Epstein case. I did another one. I can't remember it. Anyway, yeah, you're absolutely right that it's something that is scary in the US particularly. I must tell you a story about when I first came to the US to go to one of the assassination conferences, and I was stopped at the border like most people are, and asked why I wanted to come into the United States, and I said I was going to the conference, and the officer asked me if I was speaking at the conference, and I said no, I'm not this time, and he said, what's the title of the conference? And I thought, oh no, Coalition on Political Assassinations. And I could hear the gloves being snapped on in the background as they said, come to this room, Mr. Kent. Wasn't a pleasant experience, but I guess that's when my CIA file got opened. Yeah.
Russell, I appreciate the time you've given me to be able to talk on my show, man. It's been a pleasure. And I appreciate the research that you do as well, too. Sorry, I'm not as, I guess, into the medical evidence as much. I'm very new to it still.
Not at all.
It's a, like I said, it's a messy situation. I mean, the whole case is messy, but I'm glad that there's someone like you that makes a book able to explain it to people like me, who might have a hard time following it or trying to understand it. Is there a place where people can find any of your links, a website, where people can order your books as well too?
Thank you, Robbie. You're welcome. And thanks for your kind comments. I don't have a website at the moment. I've not set one up. I'm probably remiss in doing that. I'm too busy writing my next book is my excuse. People can buy the ebook on Amazon. Just look up my name, Russell Kent, or JFK Medical Betrayal. There isn't a hard copy of the book yet. Amazon do give you the option of having a print on demand. The reason I've not done print on demand so that people can get a physical copy is that you can't, as an author, you don't have control over the placement of the text and the diagrams in the text. So it knocks out the index. And I didn't want to have people print a book where the index was incorrect. I thought that would do nothing for my credibility, and it would do nothing to help people navigate through the book. So currently it's not available hard copy. I have printed a few to give out when I'm talking, or to sell at conferences. So if you come to a conference and try and find me, I'll have a copy of the book, and I'll gladly sign it up for you.
Well, I'm going to link all your links, at least where people can find some of your videos as well too, of you speaking as well. I appreciate the time you've given me a chat on this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.